My son's girlfriend leaned toward her aunt across the Thanksgiving table, dropped her voice to what she thought was a careful whisper, and said in Russian, "This old man is completely useless. Look at him. He has no idea what's happening right in front of his face." Her aunt covered a smile with her napkin. "Perfect," she replied. "Just keep him happy a little longer." My son was refilling wine glasses 3 feet away, oblivious. I reached for the gravy boat and kept my expression exactly as it had been for the past 40 years of my career, neutral, patient, giving nothing away. Because what Natasha didn't know, what nobody at that table knew except me, was that I had spent 18 years with the RCMP tracking Russian-speaking fraud networks across eastern Canada. My Russian was not textbook Russian. It was street Russian, wiretap Russian. The kind you learn listening to organized crime conversations in the back of a surveillance van at 2 a.m. in January. I understood every single word she said, and what I heard next changed everything. But before I tell you what happened at that dinner table, let me ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. I love hearing from you. The smell of roasting turkey had filled my house on Elgin Street since 7 that morning. Canadian Thanksgiving had always been the one holiday I cooked from scratch. A tradition my wife Margaret had started when Daniel was still small enough to help with the cranberry sauce without making a complete disaster of the kitchen. Margaret had been gone 4 years now. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Daniel had driven up from Toronto every single weekend during those 6 weeks, sleeping on the couch, waking at odd hours to sit with her. He was a good son. He was a trusting son. That was both his finest quality and the thing that worried me most about him. I was 63 years old, retired after 31 years, the last 18 of which had been spent with the Integrated Market Enforcement Team and later the Proceeds of Crime Unit, based out of the Ottawa Detachment. My specific focus had been fraud operations run through Ukrainian and Russian immigrant communities, not because those communities were inherently criminal, but because that's where the files took me. And so I learned the language, deeply and thoroughly, because that's what the work required. When I retired, my commanding officer said I spoke Russian better than half the informants we'd used over the years. I considered that a compliment. Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening in September to tell me about Natasha. He'd met her 3 months earlier at a fundraiser for a Ukrainian newcomers organization in Toronto. She was 29, originally from Kyiv, he said, had come to Canada 18 months ago under the Ukrainian Emergency Refugee Program following the war. She taught ESL part-time and volunteered with a seniors outreach organization on weekends. She was, in his words, the most genuine person he had ever met. Could he bring her to Thanksgiving? Of course, I said. Of course. She arrived with her aunt, a woman in her late 50s named Irina, who Daniel explained was Natasha's only family in Canada, having arrived from Lviv the previous spring. They came through my front door carrying a store-bought pecan pie and a bottle of Ontario ice wine, and Natasha looked exactly as Daniel had described, warm eyes, careful manners, the kind of composure that reads as dignity until you've spent enough years in interview rooms to recognize that it can also read as performance. "Mr. MacAllister, thank you so much for having us," she said, pressing my hand in both of hers. "Daniel talks about you constantly. I feel like I already know you." Her English was excellent, a slight accent, but controlled and clear. "He says you were a police officer for many years. That must have been so interesting." 31 years, I said. "Mostly desk work toward the end. Come in, please. Dinner's almost ready." Irina smiled warmly and said in English that my house was beautiful, that she could see Daniel got his good taste from his father. I thanked her and led them to the living room where Daniel was already pouring drinks. The meal was, by any measure, a success. The turkey was properly brined. The stuffing had dried cranberries and wild rice the way Margaret used to make it. Daniel was happier than I had seen him in years, attentive and relaxed, leaning toward Natasha whenever she spoke as if afraid of missing something important. Irina asked thoughtful questions about Ottawa, about the Rideau Canal in winter, about whether I still kept up with hockey now that I was retired. She was engaging and funny. Both of them were. And that, I knew from long experience, was not necessarily a point in their favor. It happened during dessert. I was cutting into the pecan pie they'd brought when Natasha reached across the table to touch Irina's arm and switched languages entirely, her voice dropping to something conversational and quick. "He's exactly how Daniel described," she said in Russian. Slow, comfortable. He thinks we came here to make a good impression. She smiled at something on the table. He has no idea, Irina replied without looking up from her plate. How much does he actually have, do you think? Daniel mentioned the pension from the government. The house is his outright, no mortgage. And there's an investment account from the wife. Life insurance payout. A small sound, almost amused. These retired government men, they're always the easiest. They spent their whole careers following rules, and they cannot imagine someone who doesn't. My hand continued to move the pie server. My face did not change. The adrenaline that moved through me was familiar. I had felt it in courtrooms, in surveillance vans, outside apartment doors in the early morning with a warrant in my hand. I breathed through it. I set a piece of pie on Daniel's plate and asked Irina if she would like tea. By 9 o'clock, they were gone. Daniel lingered at the door, flushed with the warmth of what he believed had been a perfect evening. Dad, I can't tell you how much tonight meant to me. She really wanted this to go well. She was nervous all week. I put my hand on his shoulder. She seemed comfortable by the end. Did you like her? Be honest. I think, I said carefully, that she is a very composed young woman. He grinned and hugged me and drove back down the 417 toward Toronto, and I stood in the driveway until his taillights disappeared. The October air was sharp and clean. The neighbor's maple had gone completely red. Normal things. Ordinary things. The kind of things that continue calmly around the edges of something that is not ordinary at all. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, without turning on any lights. The following Monday, I called Sandra Chen. We had worked together for 11 years at the RCMP before she moved to the Canada Border Services Agency, where she now ran an investigations unit out of the National Capital Region office. We had breakfast once a month at a place on Bank Street, and she still called me whenever she had a wiretap transcript she wanted a second opinion on, off the books and over coffee, the way retired colleagues do. She answered on the second ring and said, without preamble, "You sound like you have a file." "I might have a situation," I said. "Not a file. A personal matter. I need to know if I'm being irrational before I do anything." She told me to meet her at the usual place at noon. I told her what I had heard at the Thanksgiving table. I told her the names Natasha Volkov and the aunt Irina, last name unknown. I told her about the Ukrainian refugee program, the ESL teaching, the seniors outreach organization, the details Daniel had shared over the previous 3 months. I told her about the investment account and the pension in the house. And I told her, because Sandra already knew about my language skills and would hear it in my account anyway, exactly what the conversation had sounded like, not nervous or careless, but smooth, practiced, like a conversation they had had versions of before. Sandra listened without interrupting. When I finished, she drank her coffee and looked at me for a moment. "You want me to run the names? I want to know if I'm a paranoid old man who just watched his son fall in love with someone he's not sure about." "You're not paranoid," she said. "Your former proceeds of crime. There's a difference." She picked up the paper where I had written the names and folded it. "Give me 72 hours. She called me on Thursday evening. "Robert, the aunt isn't an aunt." I sat down. Sandra had run both names through CBSA databases, cross-referenced with Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada records, and flagged it internally with a colleague who handled refugee documentation fraud. Natasha Volkov existed in the system. She had arrived through the Ukraine Emergency Authorization in March of the previous year. The documentation was real. The woman using it, however, did not match the photographs in the original file. Natasha Volkov, the actual person, was currently living in Brampton, working as a personal support worker. The woman who had sat across my Thanksgiving table and touched my son's arm and called me slow and comfortable and easy, her real name, according to a document trail Sandra's colleague had found through an active investigation already underway in Toronto, was Daria Morozova, originally from Krasnodar, Russia, not a refugee. A Russian national who had purchased the fraudulent documentation through a network already known to CBSA. The aunt, Irina, had a Canadian actor's equity card. Her real name was Beverly Thornton, and she lived in Nepean and had a profile on a casting website for corporate events and promotional work. Someone had paid her a flat rate, Sandra suspected, to play a role. The final piece was the hardest. Sandra told me quietly, because she knew what it meant. that Daria Morozova was listed in the RCMP's financial crimes database as a person of interest in a pattern of cases involving the gradual financial exploitation of partners, specifically targeting men in their 30s with family money, government pensions, or real estate assets. The pattern was always the same: a relationship that moved quickly toward commingling of finances, joint accounts, beneficiary changes, power of attorney discussions framed as practical planning. She had done this before. In one case, in Vancouver, a man had lost $340,000 before realizing what had happened. In another, in Hamilton, the case was still before the courts. "Robert," Sandra said, "has Daniel changed anything financially in the last 3 months?" I said I didn't know, and the fact that I didn't know was, in itself, an answer of a kind. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and thought about Daniel at 22, telling me he'd failed his third-year statistics exam and didn't know if he was smart enough for finance. I thought about the way he'd sat by Margaret's hospital bed reading to her from a biography of Terry Fox, because it was her favorite, and he couldn't think of anything else to do with his hands. I thought about his face at that Thanksgiving table, turned toward Natasha the way a plant turns toward light, and I thought about a woman who had looked at that face and seen a transaction. By morning, I had decided what to do. I called Sandra and told her I wanted to speak to someone at the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit. Formally, officially, with whatever I had. She said she would make the call, and that given the existing file on Daria Morozova, they would likely be interested. She was right. By Friday afternoon, I was sitting in a meeting room at a building on Heron Road across from a staff sergeant named Kevin Malhotra, who was young enough to have been one of my junior officers and had the particular kind of focused calm that comes from working financial crimes, where everything moves slowly and then all at once. He reviewed everything Sandra had compiled and asked me 2 hours of detailed questions. At the end, he leaned back and said, "Mr. MacAllister, we've had this file for 8 months, and we've been waiting for the right moment. What you've brought us accelerates the timeline considerably." He paused. "Would you be willing to participate in a controlled operation?" I had been expecting the question. "You want a second dinner?" "With full RCMP support, we'd place surveillance equipment in your home. Officers positioned outside and in vehicles on the street. If she says anything incriminating about finances, about the documentation, about the network, we'd have it on record." Malhotra looked at me steadily. "I want to be clear about what this means for your son. If the operation proceeds and we make an arrest, he will see it happen, in his father's home." I looked at the wall for a moment. "Better he sees it there," I said, "than discovers it 3 years from now when he's trying to understand where his money went." I called Daniel the next morning. The conversation required every skill I had spent 3 decades developing. I told him I wanted to apologize, that I had been reserved at Thanksgiving, and that wasn't fair to Natasha, who had made every effort. That I had been thinking about his mother a lot lately, about how she always told me my caution was a professional hazard and I needed to leave it at the office sometimes. I said I would like to have them both back for dinner, and Natasha's aunt too, if she was available, the following Friday evening. The silence on his end lasted long enough that I thought I had miscalculated. Then he said, "Dad, that actually means a lot. She's going to be so relieved." I set the table for 6 on Friday afternoon with the RCMP technicians still in the house. They were professional and thorough, and by 4 o'clock you would not have known they had been there except that I knew where each device was. 2 officers were in a vehicle on the street in front of the retired teacher's house next door. Malhotra himself was in an unmarked car around the corner. I wore a listening device under my flannel shirt, and it felt, in an entirely different way than the Thanksgiving one had, like armor. They arrived at 6:30. Daria Natasha carried a bottle of Quebec ice cider and seemed, if anything, more relaxed than the previous visit. Beverly Thornton, playing Irina once more, hugged me at the door and said it was wonderful to be invited back. Daniel hung their coats and looked at me with an expression of such uncomplicated gratitude that I had to look away for a moment under the pretense of adjusting the thermostat. Dinner moved the way dinner moves when everyone at the table except one person believes things are going well. I asked Natasha about her ESL students. I asked Beverly about how Irina had been finding the Ottawa winters compared to Lviv. I watched Natasha's hands, the way she touched Daniel's arm at intervals that felt counted rather than spontaneous. I watched Beverly's face when Daniel spoke about his job, the brief professional assessment before the warm smile returned. I had sat across from people like this in interview rooms. The skill that made them effective was exactly the same skill that made them, to someone with enough experience, visible. After dinner, I served coffee and brought out a loaf cake with maple glaze that I had made from a recipe Margaret's sister had sent after the funeral. Daria complimented it. She said that Daniel had mentioned my late wife was a wonderful baker, and that it was clear he had learned from her spirit, at least. It was a skilled thing to say, personal, warm, including the dead woman in the room, in a way designed to lower defenses. I thanked her. Then I set down my coffee cup. "Natasha," I said, "I've been thinking about our last dinner together." She tilted her head with an expression of polite interest. "Oh," I switched to Russian. "Specifically about what you said to your aunt during dessert." The change was immediate and total. The color left her face. Across the table, Beverly went very still. Daniel's fork stopped halfway to his plate. "You called me slow," I continued in Russian. "Comfortable. You said retired government men are always the easiest because they spent their careers following rules and can't imagine someone who doesn't." I kept my voice level, the same tone I had used for 31 years in rooms like this one, or rooms nothing like this one. "You asked how much I had. You mentioned the pension, the house, the life insurance money." I paused. I understood every word. "Dead." Daniel's voice came out as something between a question and a statement. "You speak Russian?" 18 years working organized crime. I speak it quite well. I did not take my eyes off Daria. Her name is not Natasha Volkov. The real Natasha Volkov lives in Brampton. This woman's name is Daria Morozova. She is a Russian national who purchased fraudulent refugee documentation, and she has done what she has been doing with you, son, to at least 2 other men in this country. One of them lost $340,000. Daria stood up. The performance dissolved completely, the way a held breath releases, and what replaced it was cold and practical. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Daniel, he has had a problem with me since the beginning. He's been looking for a reason." "Sit down, Daria." It was not a request. "The people outside will want you to." Beverly stood as well, her chair scraping, and said in a voice stripped of the Lviv accent, "I don't know anything. She hired me for 2 dinners. I thought it was for a surprise proposal or something." And then, collapsing into something that might have been genuine distress, "I didn't know it was anything like this. I'm an actress. She found me through a casting website." Daniel was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on him since he was 8 years old and had broken a window and was waiting to understand what would happen next. "Dad, how long have you known?" I suspected the first night. "I've been investigating for 3 weeks. 3 weeks." He said it flatly, processing. "Son, I know this is—" "No." He held up his hand, not angry. "Something else. Something that takes longer to name. Just give me a minute." The knock at the door was firm and unhurried. Malhotra entered with 2 officers. He introduced himself to the room and addressed Daria by her legal name and told her she was being detained pending formal charges related to immigration fraud, identity fraud, and criminal breach of trust. He was courteous. He was completely immovable. Daria did not run. She looked at me once, with an expression that contained no particular feeling I could read, and then she looked at Daniel, and whatever she was looking for in his face, she did not find. The officers were professional and quiet, and within 4 minutes they were gone, and the door closed, and the house was still. Beverly sat in her chair with her coat half on and her hands clasped tightly together. One of the officers had taken her contact information and told her she would be needed to provide a statement. She left without speaking to anyone, closing the door carefully behind her. Daniel sat at the table for a long time without moving. The maple cake was still in the center of the table. The coffee had gone cold. I moved to clear the plates, and he said, without looking up, "Leave it, please." I sat back down. After several minutes, he said, "How much did she actually get?" "We don't believe any assets were transferred. Malhotra's unit has been monitoring the file for 8 months. They would have flagged a significant transfer." I paused. "But I need to ask you directly, son. Has anything changed with your accounts in the last few months? Any conversations about joint accounts, beneficiary designations, power of attorney?" He looked up then. Something moved across his face that I recognized as the specific humiliation of a smart person who has been fooled. She mentioned, about 6 weeks ago, that it would make sense for us to have a joint emergency fund, in case anything happened. She said it was something her parents had always done. He rubbed his face. I thought she was being practical. Did you set it up? No. I said I wanted to wait until we were actually engaged. A long pause. She seemed a little frustrated, but she didn't push it. I exhaled slowly. Dad! He looked at me across the table. You said 2 other men. One of them lost $340,000. Yes. And you sat across from her at Thanksgiving, and you already knew. You spent the whole meal knowing, and you didn't. He stopped. If I had told you what I heard that night, would you have believed me? The silence that followed was its own answer. He called me the following Wednesday, late enough that I had already locked up and turned off the porch light. His voice had the quality of someone who has been thinking in circles for several days and has finally found the edge of the thought they've been chasing. I keep coming back to the same thing, he said. I brought her into your home. On Thanksgiving, I brought her to Mom's table, basically, and sat there telling you she was the most genuine person I'd ever met. His voice was steady, but I could hear the effort it took. And you sat there and listened, and you didn't say a single word that would have made me feel like an idiot. Even though you already knew. I didn't know, I said. I suspected. There's a difference. And if I'd been wrong, you weren't wrong. No. But if I had been, and I had blown up your relationship because of a suspicion I couldn't prove, you'd have spent years wondering. I chose the next words carefully, because they were the true ones. I needed to give you the truth. Not a suspicion. The truth, with evidence you could see and hold. That's the only way you don't spend the rest of your life second-guessing yourself. A long silence. Can I come up this weekend? I'll make sure there's coffee. The good kind. The good kind, he repeated, and I could hear the beginning of something in it that wasn't quite a laugh, but was at least in the same family. He arrived on Saturday with 2 bags of dark roast from a place on Queen Street he'd been going to since university, and we sat in the kitchen for 4 hours, and I walked him through everything: the Thanksgiving conversation in Russian, the call to Sandra, the CBSA file, the meeting with Malhotra, the surveillance equipment in the dining room on the second Friday. He asked careful questions. His training in financial analysis meant he understood, maybe better than most people would have, exactly how the mechanism was supposed to work, how the joint account would have been the first step, how the emergency fund framing was designed to feel practical rather than strategic, how, given time, the rest would have followed. At the end of it, he sat back and looked at me the way he sometimes looked at a spreadsheet that had finally resolved into a clear number. She chose you specifically, he said, or chose me because of you, the pension, the house, Mom's life insurance payout. He paused. She did the math on our family. Yes, and you did the math on her. We were quiet for a moment. Outside, the street was busy with a Saturday afternoon's worth of ordinary activity. Someone raking leaves. A dog pulling at its leash past the window. The kind of scene that continues on indifferently around whatever is happening inside a house. Dad, Daniel said finally, when Mom was sick, when I used to drive up every weekend and sleep on the couch. He looked at the kitchen window where her picture still sat on the sill, the one from their 35th anniversary trip to Prince Edward Island. Did she know how bad it was going to be? Yes, I said. She knew fairly early. She didn't want you to have more weeks of dreading it. She wanted you to have more weeks of just being with her. He looked at the picture for a long time. That's what you did too, he said. You didn't tell me what you suspected at Thanksgiving. You wanted me to have the truth, not the suspicion. I didn't say anything. Same instinct, he said quietly. Different situation. Malhotra called the following Monday to tell me that Daria Morozova had been formally charged with identity fraud and criminal breach of trust. The immigration charges would proceed concurrently through CBSA. Beverly Thornton had provided a full statement and would receive a conditional discharge given her cooperation and lack of criminal history. Deportation proceedings for Daria were underway. The investigation into the broader network that had supplied the fraudulent documentation was ongoing. Your participation made a significant difference, Malhotra said. The controlled dinner gave us the corroborating evidence we needed for charges that will actually stick. A pause. How is your son? He's a MacAllister, I said. He'll be all right. It was true. He came up most weekends through November. We watched hockey and argued about the Senators' defensemen and had long arguments about things that didn't matter, which is a particular luxury of people who have gotten the things that matter sorted out. He started asking different questions at work, better questions, he told me, about things that felt rehearsed. He called one evening to say that a contractor his company had been considering had turned out to have fabricated 3 of his references, something Daniel had caught by digging 2 levels deeper than anyone else had bothered to. I just kept thinking about what you said, he told me, about the difference between someone who's polished and someone who's actually solid. I told him the difference is usually time. Solid things don't change when you apply a little pressure. Polished things do. 6 weeks after the dinner, I was in my workshop behind the house, an old habit from my service years, keeping my hands busy when my mind needed quiet fixing a vintage clock radio that belonged to the woman down the street, the one whose late husband had been an engineer and had maintained every piece of technology in that house himself until he no longer could. She wanted it restored for her granddaughter. I was deep in the interior of it, the smell of old circuits and machine oil around me, when Daniel came through the back door carrying 2 coffees from the Tim Hortons 2 blocks away, which he knew I didn't actually prefer, but which he bought whenever he wanted to signal that this was a casual visit and not a serious one. He set a cup next to my elbow and perched on the stool by the workbench the way he had been doing since he was 12. Still at it? Almost done. The tuner was the issue. The rest of it is fine. He watched me work for a while. I've been thinking, he said eventually, about what you said. That loving someone isn't blindness. That it's hope. I set down the small screwdriver and waited. I don't want to stop hoping, he said. I don't want to be the person who thinks everyone is running an angle. That's not who I want to be. Then don't be, I said. There's a difference between caution and suspicion. Caution means you pay attention. Suspicion means you've already decided. I picked up the screwdriver again. Your mother was the most trusting person I ever knew. And she was also, consistently, an excellent judge of character. Those 2 things went together, not against each other. She trusted carefully. She paid attention. And when something felt wrong, she said so. I turned the screw. She would have said something at that Thanksgiving dinner, too. She just would have said it more diplomatically than I do. He laughed. It was the first real laugh I had heard from him in weeks, and it filled the workshop the way a window being opened fills a room. That's fair, he said. You were never exactly diplomatic. I was diplomatic for 31 years on the job. I used it all up. He stayed for 3 hours, helped me with the inventory, asked questions about some of the older pieces that were waiting for repair, and at the door on his way out, he turned back, the way he does when something has been sitting with him and is finally ready to be said out loud. Thanks, Dad, he said. Not just for the Daria thing. For all of it. I nodded. Go drive carefully. The 417 gets icy in November. He rolled his eyes the way he had been rolling his eyes at my driving reminders for 15 years, and got in his car, and I stood in the cold air of the driveway until he pulled away. Inside, I made tea and sat for a while at the kitchen table with Margaret's picture. The house was quiet in the way that a house with good walls and good insulation is quiet on a cold November night in Ottawa, which is a particular and complete kind of quiet. I had spent a lot of evenings in this quiet over the past 4 years, and I had made a kind of peace with it, though peace is perhaps too settled a word. I had made a working arrangement with it. Our boy is all right, I told her photograph. He's paying attention now, without being afraid. That's the thing you hope for, I think. Not that they never get hurt. Just that, when they do, it makes them wiser rather than harder. I poured the rest of my tea into the sink and turned off the light. There is something I have learned in 63 years that I did not fully understand until the last few of them. The instincts we spend our lives developing do not stop being useful when we stop being paid for them. They become something different. They become the way we love the people we can't afford to lose. Every year I spent learning to read a room, to hear the word beneath the word, to be patient when patience was the hardest thing. None of it was separate from being a father. It was all the same work. The uniform changes. The instinct doesn't. If this story has stayed with you, I hope it's because some part of it is familiar. Not the fraud, maybe, or the Russian, or the Thanksgiving table, but the particular feeling of knowing something and not being believed, and choosing to prove it rather than argue about it, or the feeling of being loved by someone who could see what you couldn't see yet, and being given the evidence instead of the lecture. If you've experienced something like that, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if someone in your life could use this story today, please pass it along. They might need it more than they know.